On April 10th, 1964, Capitol Records released their second Beatles album, which they called the Beatles Second album. 17 days later, Capitol Canada released their third Beatles album, and they called that Long Tall Sally. Despite appearing almost identical, they not only had a different track listing, but a totally different sound. In this video, I'll compare every aspect of these albums, their contents, appearance, and sound quality, and I'll also tell you which one I prefer and why. I'm Andrew from Parlogram Auctions, and welcome to the Beatles Second versus Third. On the 4th of April 1964, the Beatles had the top 5 singles in the Billboard charts, and Capitol were about to release the follow-up to Meet the Beatles. Such was the popularity of the group and the quality of the material available. Even Capitol's pop music-hating Dave Dexter Jr., the man in charge of issuing Beatles records, couldn't fail to produce a winning album. Dexter had ignored and dismissed the Beatles during most of 1963, which had allowed Chicago-based label VJ to pick up the option of the Please Please Me album, which they duly issued as introducing the Beatles in January 1964. In a brazen attempt to cancel VJ's album, Capitol titled their new album the Beatles Second album, something which Capitol Canada didn't have to do. If you've seen our recent video about the Beatles in Canada, you'll know that Dexter's opposite number there, Paul White, had faith in the Beatles right from the start, and had issued all of their early singles on Capitol in Canada. Not only that, he'd also released a Beatles album called Beatlemania with the Beatles, 2 months before Meet the Beatles. This had been followed up by their unique Twist and Shout album in February 1964, a video about which will be coming soon. This asynchronization had caused friction between Capitol Canada and its parent company in Hollywood, which was exacerbated by the release of their response to the second album 2.5 weeks later. Permission had been granted to Capitol Canada to use the same artwork as the US album, but as this was Canada's third Beatles album, there was no way they could use the same title. Instead, they named it after one of the new tracks on the album, Long Tall Sally. Given the choice of that, or I Call Your Name, or You Can't Do That, it was probably the right choice. But can you think of another Beatles album anywhere in the world which was named after a song not written by them? The disadvantage that Capitol Canada had over Capitol USA, as far as the track listing was concerned, was that they'd already issued most of the Beatles' EMI catalogue, and only 2 new tracks were available. One of the ways they solved this was to trim the album from their usual 7 tracks per side to 6 on each, which incidentally still adds up to 1 more than on the Capitol album. Despite both looking very similar from a distance, they are quite different albums. So let's have a look at them side by side to see how they compare. Firstly, the covers both use the same George Osaki design, featuring the sepia-tinted photo collage, all of which were taken by Joe Covello and licensed through Black Star. The font of the Beatles wording on the front is identical, but it's not carried onto the Long Tall Sally wording in the same way as it is on the second album. Beneath that, the Long Tall Sally cover highlights the new tracks, whereas the second album chooses to emphasize the group's members' sound and British roots. And of course, the Capitol logo on the US album is replaced by the Capitol 6000 series logo on the Canadian album, along with the printer's Litho in Canada wording. The rear panel layouts are also similar but different. The Canadian cover strangely makes a point of proclaiming a new recording of Roll Over Beethoven, despite it having been released as a single 4 months previously. Both show miniature covers. On the US, it's Meet the Beatles, and Beatlemania and Twist and Shout are both shown on the Canadian. As the Canadian album was only issued in mono, the also available in stereo text is replaced by the Recorded in England legend. The addition of Paul White's name in the lower left corner ruffled some feathers in the tower, but more about that later. So that's the artwork out of the way. Now let's go through the album's tracks and find out how they compare entertainment-wise. Both of the albums get off to a strong start, but Long Tall Sally takes the early lead, opening up with I Want to Hold Your Hand and I Saw Her Standing There, a la Meet the Beatles. The second album kicks off with Roll Over Beethoven, followed by one of their weaker tracks, Thank You Girl, which had already been issued on VJ, twice. Tracks 3 and 4 are the same on both albums, You Really Got a Hold on Me, followed by Devil in Her Heart. These two tracks were new for American fans, but had already been released in Canada on Beatlemania with the Beatles, which in itself was an exact copy of the UK with the Beatles album. The second album finishes side 1 strongly, with the new track Money, followed by the flip side to their current number 145, Can't Buy Me Love, You Can't Do That. The last two tracks on side 1 of the Canadian album are Roll Over Beethoven, which had already been released on the Beatlemania album and as a single in December 1963, and the downbeat Misery, which had been left off the Twist and Shout album. New tracks to both countries open up side 2, Long Tall Sally and I Call Your Name, which are followed by Please Mr. Postman. Again, this was new to the US but old to Canada, where it had already been issued as the B-side to Roll Over Beethoven. The Canadian album then drops in tempo by adding This Boy, before resyncing with the US album for another single B-side, I'll Get You. The US album finishes off strongly with She Loves You, the track that had closed Capitol's Twist and Shout album, whilst the Canadian album finishes off with You Can't Do That, which is a pretty decent closer too. Capitol's second album was of course a huge success and is today many first-generation fans' favourite album. Looking at it from today's perspective, Long Tall Sally is still a decent album too, but back in 1964, Canadian record buyers felt a bit short-changed. The sales figures bore that out, and sales of this album were down 55% against the Beatlemania album, and 64% down on Twist and Shout. It seems Capitol Canada had become victims of their own success, but more trouble was brewing. Up until this point, the boss of Capitol Canada, Paul White, it seemed had been putting more effort into his relationship with EMI in London rather than with his bosses in Hollywood. Their prickly relationship came to a head in April 1964, when, angered by the addition of White's production credit on the album's jacket, Capitol sent White a strongly worded letter basically telling him to toe the company line, and that all future Beatles releases would have to conform to the US format. Now, unlike many of you, I suspect, I didn't grow up with either of these albums, and I don't have any nostalgic connection with them, so I'm coming at this review from a completely neutral perspective. However, if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you'll know that one thing I am familiar with is the sound quality of Beatles records. So let's take a closer look at that. Both Capitol USA and Capitol Canada received identical copy tapes from EMI in London, which contained true stereo mixes where they were available. The big difference is that Capitol USA re-EQ'd theirs and Capitol Canada didn't. It's well known that Dave Dexter hated the sound of these EMI tapes and set about changing their sound to his liking by putting them through Capitol's echo chamber and slapping on a heavy dose of compression. His defense for doing that was saying that he wanted to give the sound a heartbeat, but for many, he killed them stone dead. Capitol Canada, on the other hand, had taken a more purist approach and had issued their previous two albums without any sonic modification. Their album was cut directly from the EMI assembled master tape and carried the familiar mono XEX UK prefix, and as a result, the tracks sound much closer and are, if anything, a little less compressed than the UK version. Although I'm unable to let you hear the difference between them due to copyright and all that, I can illustrate a little bit of what I mean on this RX software. Now, I'm only going to cover the mono pressing in this comparison, and the copy of the second album I'm using is this East Coast Scranton pressing. The Canadian copy is a standard first pressing, which, like all Canadian Beatles records from this period, were pressed by RCA. And the track I'm going to look at is Long Tall Sally. Here's the waveform of that track recorded from the Canadian album. The blue area, the waveform, has a very spiky appearance, which means that at least it has some decent dynamics. There's also some decent high-end performance, which is measured by the orange colour going towards the top of the graph, which goes beyond 20 kHz. I'll switch back to the waveform and show you the same track from the US pressing. As it changes, you can see the waveform become much fatter, and the spikes or dynamic peaks become much shallower. This time, the spectrograph shows virtually no signal information above the 12 kHz range, making it sound dull and lifeless compared to the Canadian disc. Most of the tracks on this mono album were fold-downs, which means that they were created by combining the left and right channels of the original UK stereo tapes. The stereo mixes used completely different reverb and compression settings to the mono. I think the heavy compression on the US pressing robs the sound of its ambience and reverb and suffocates the dynamics of the original recording. The Canadian disc, while not as dynamic as the UK EP, is more faithful to the original recording, and from my neutral point of view has a cleaner, better sound. But again, do let me know in the comments what you think about the sound quality of either or both of these albums. Now, being a serious collector, it would be remiss of me not to mention the UK pressing. Yes, there really was a genuine UK EMI pressing of this album, which was issued in 1965. From 1964 to 1966, EMI pressed 3 Capitol albums for export. Something New, Beatles 6, and this album. Pressed in stereo only, they were produced in very limited quantities by EMI at their factory in Hayes. This was done chiefly to satisfy demand from US service personnel serving in Europe, mainly in Germany. They were sold at the PX or Part Exchange store on military bases at a discounted rate. The front cover design of this and the others was the same as the Capitol albums, except that the Capitol logo gave way to the Parlophone EMI symbol. As with all other UK LPs of the time, it was front laminated, with the familiar flipbacks on the rear panel. The rear cover included the same banner wording, track listing, and photo collage, along with all of the other contemporary EMI features, such as Emitex and the compatibility notice, together with its export series catalogue number, CPCS 103. The disc itself bore the standard yellow and black Parlophone stereo label. Some copies had McCartney spelt as McCarthy on the Thank You Girl credits. Instead of making up the album from their own master tapes, EMI used a copy of Capitol's master tape to cut this album. You know how I'm always going on about how good the British pressings are? Well, this one is the exception. It's a truly terrible sounding record, and the original Capitol stereo pressing beats it hands down. Really. If you want to hear this album at its authentic best, I'd advise you to listen to the CD of it from the 2004 Capitol Albums Volume 1 box set. But don't bother with this one from the US album set, because whilst it uses the same track listing, it substitutes the 2009 versions of the tracks. The only authentic tracks on here are the mono versions of Long Tall Sally and I Call Your Name. If you want the real deal, you need this. So coming back to my original question, is there a winner between these two? Well, that depends to a large extent on which one you grew up with or experienced first. For myself, who didn't grow up with either, both have their pluses and minuses. I'm not a fan of the sound of the second album, but with those Motown Detroit covers and blistering rock and roll standards, it truly rocks from start to finish, without any show tunes or ballads to spoil the excitement. Although the Canadian album sounds better to my ears, and with its one extra track is better value, Misery and This Boy sound out of place, and it isn't as thrilling overall as the US album. But again, that's just my opinion. I'd love to hear yours, along with your thoughts and memories of this album in the comments. If you'd like to find out more about the Beatles in Canada, I recommend you read Piers Hemmingson's excellent book, The Beatles in Canada, The Origins of Beatlemania. Or take a look at his great website, capital6000.com. Links for both of those are in the description. I'll be looking at more US albums in the near future, so let me know if there's something specific you'd like to see me cover. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our website parlogramauctions.com for lots of great sounding Beatles vinyl. Also, please consider subscribing or even becoming a member, as it all helps to keep the channel and, more importantly, the Beatles legacy going. I hope you'll join me next time for some more fascinating Beatles stories. But I'm done for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.